Green Party has been gobbling up support under its new leader in England and Wales, Zack Polanski, who's with us this morning. Welcome to you. Good to have you with us in the studio.
Thanks for having me.
We just heard Hadi Alexander there strongly hinting that the limit on benefits for bigger families, known as the two-child benefit cap, is going to go. If that is swept away, is that a victory for the left, maybe including you?
Absolutely. It's something we've been calling for a long time. 1 in 3 children are living in poverty, and this would lift 300,000 children out of poverty almost immediately. It's absolutely outrageous it's taken the Labour government so long to do it. But if they do it, that'll be a victory and they'll celebrate it. More widely, though, we know that this Chancellor will keep talking about tough choices, but they always seem to be tough choices for people out of work or working people who are working really hard while their wages aren't going up, but food prices are going up, for disabled people. When are we going to see tough choices for multimillionaires and billionaires? It's time to tax the rich.
Well, let's then look at what's actually happened in terms of taxes. You want to increase taxes on wealth, but this is what's happened to income tax actually over the last few decades. So in the last 20 years, actually, and the lines are a bit wobbly, but what it shows us is actually people at the top 10%, their share of income tax paid has gone up about 10%. And it's actually gone down a little bit for middle and bottom earners. So just before we get into this debate, the fact is the Conservatives and then the Labour government have, broadly speaking, taxed the rich more and taxed other earners less.
So this is about inequality. For decades now, poor people have got poorer and rich people have got richer. It's important when I talk about millionaires and billionaires. If you go back, say, 1 million minutes, you get back to the beginning of 2023. Most people can probably remember what they were doing at the beginning of 2023. If you go back 1 billion minutes, you get to the Roman Empire. That's the difference in inequality in this country. So I'm talking about multimillionaires and billionaires paying their fair share. Now, it's important to say, people will say, does that raise enough? Is it just about raising revenue? That's not actually the point. Of course, the money is important. Well, the real point is about tackling inequality.
So the point then for you of putting up tax on the very wealthy is to try to stop them being as wealthy. It's not actually to raise money for schools and hospitals and public services.
We can raise that money anyway. What it's about is the fact that if you have that much money, if you're a billionaire, you can't spend it quickly, even if you try. So you hoard it in assets. And it's the assets that are the problem here, because that's exacerbating the inequality that already exists. But what we need to do is get that money and those assets flowing around the economy.
But how do you raise that money anyway if it's not through taxation?
Well, there's a few ways. So Sharon was exactly right earlier when she's talking about borrowing to invest. That's one way. But also there's something called spending multipliers, which is where you invest in the economy, say the National Health Service. You get that money back because you have a well population. Now, of course, it's important that people are healthy just to be healthy. But actually, if you cut through austerity, that's a completely false economy. You have people missing work, you have more long-term health conditions, and you break the economy in the way that we've seen both Conservative governments do it and Labour government now too.
But you say there you can borrow. The government's already borrowing enormous amounts, and there is an already massive amount of national debt. And it's way more than the government spends every year, and it costs a fortune to pay the interest on that debt. So would you not put any limits on government borrowing?
Well, the first thing to say is debt to GDP ratio is at 100%. In Japan, it's 270%, and they have much better living standards than we do.
But in terms of this country, it's at the highest level it's been for a very, very long time. The financial markets are very sensitive to the decisions that the Chancellor makes. That's the case whether you'd like it or not. The UK's already got huge levels of debt. So are you suggesting that actually you'd be relaxed about the government borrowing much, much more?
Well, I think Andy Burnham was really interesting recently when he said we need to stop being in hock to the bond markets. And I think
there was a market reaction.
Well, exactly. So what I think we need to do is get back to a place where actually democratic politicians who are elected by the people are more worried about the cleaners, the teachers, the nurses, the people on the ground who are actually creating the economy with their hands, rather than the people who hold these assets, who are making money while they sleep without actually working. That's deeply problematic. Now, are the markets important? Of course, they play a role, but much more important is the trust of the public on the politicians that they democratically elect. And we've gone so far the other way.
But the public didn't trust the government very much when Liz Truss completely freaked out the financial markets by promising billions of unfunded tax cuts. Again, you might not like it.
Liz Truss was an absolute disaster.
But the real world that we're in right now, and you might want a completely different shape of economy. I think you do.
Yes, absolutely.
But the real world that we live in is that this country owes trillions of pounds to the financial markets, and therefore decisions that politicians take, don't they have to take them into account? You can't wish away the overdraft.
So I'm definitely not going to defend Liz Truss. I don't think anyone should. But actually, you said it really well. She was borrowing for unfunded tax cuts. What I'm talking about is borrowing for capital, infrastructure and investment that essentially creates spending multipliers that comes back into the economy. Second, though, in terms of the borrowing, a lot of that borrowing is from the Bank of England. That's money we owe to ourselves. It's not borrowing or debt in any real sense. Also, it's a lot of foreign countries who want to have that debt because actually that's a good investment for them because we have a relatively stable currency.
But before we get into, we could go down a really esoteric debate about economics.
It is important though, because
it is important.
Can I say one other thing on that though, on the esoteric?
Well, I want to ask you,
a household economy is nothing like a national budget, and we really need to break that metaphor.
And of course it is not the same thing. But people look at the government in terms of what they borrow and what they spend and how they raise money through our taxation.
But we need to break that metaphor because it's a completely different way of looking at the economy, which is really important.
I just want to get a specific answer to that question, though. Do you believe there ought to be any limit on the amount that the government borrows? Would you say? Yes,
absolutely.
And where would you set it?
It depends on how many resources you have in the economy and also people who are able to use that resources. So you have to watch inflation, but that's not about how much you borrow. That's about the physical resources in a space. Once that's run out, then you're in a problem. But we're in a problem anyway because we face a climate crisis and an ecological emergency. And so we have literal physical barriers to the amount that we should be producing.
Okay. We know that you are no fan of the defence alliance, NATO. You talked about that last time you were here, and you argue for peace wherever possible instead. Should Ukraine consider making concessions to bring an end to a terrible conflict?
Well, that's ultimately up to the Ukrainians and Zelensky. I think it's important our country stands in solidarity with the Ukrainians and also says that they should have a negotiated settlement and a sustained settlement. I think it's deeply problematic that Donald Trump seems to be bulldozing this whole settlement in the same way that he tried to in Gaza and Palestine. I think ultimately we need to make sure that we have people who are talking about peace and diplomacy at the table. And just on NATO, I've been very clear that I want an alternative alliance based on working with our European neighbours. I think Brexit was a disaster for this country, both economically, but also for our security in terms of it being outsourced to Donald Trump.
And things have been going pretty well for you since you took over as leader, and you've suggested that you'll stand as an MP in London. One poll showed that you could actually take the Holborn and St Pancras seat, which just happens to be the Prime Minister's constituency. Do you fancy taking him on?
It'd be very tempting to take Keir Starmer down. But actually what I'm doing right now is really focusing on right across England and Wales, growing the Green Party. We've just hit 175,000 members.
But you are tempted to take him on, that's what you said.
I'm tempted to take on any Labour MP that's a disaster and ultimately replace them with a better MP who will stand for people and planet rather than vested interests.
Okay, Zack Polanski, leader of the Green Party in England and Wales. Thanks very much indeed for coming in to talk to us.